What's up, everybody? I'm Mike Dwyer from the Bunker Recordings and BetterMixes.com, and today we're talking about why you should try mixing into a mastering limiter. So I talk about mixing into a limiter in my mixing course, link in the description down below, but I recently saw a video by another YouTuber. I won't mention who it was because I'm not trying to hate on his whole channel. He's got some really solid videos. I just wasn't a fan of this one in particular where he talks about how it's objectively wrong to mix into a limiter. There are so few techniques in mixing that are objectively right or wrong, so that really rubbed me the wrong way. He even said in a follow-up video that people who say it works for them, including some pretty big mix engineers, are just wrong. Like what? So today we're going to take a look at some of the reasons that mixing into a limiter works for me, and why you should try it out to see whether or not it works for you. So let's start by talking about the setup for this technique. The idea is pretty similar to top-down mixing, if you're familiar with that term, where fairly early on in the mix you add a compressor or EQ to your mix bus or master fader, and then mix into that. But in this case, obviously it's a mastering limiter. Now, to have success with this technique, you need to have some experience with mastering or faux mastering your tracks. If you're brand new to mixing, I wouldn't really recommend this technique yet, or really any form of top-down mixing, because, well, you don't have a good idea of what kind of settings to use yet. Once you've used the mix bus compressor a bunch, you'll know, yeah, I usually use these attack and release settings, or for an EQ, maybe you're always adding a little 10K or whatever. And same thing with your limiter. Once you have some kind of go-to starting point settings that typically work for your mixes, slap it on at the beginning of your mix and give this technique a shot. Once you get towards the end of the mix, you can always tweak your settings to get it working just right for that particular track. So with that out of the way, let's get into why you'd want to mix into a limiter in the first place. Let's see if this sounds familiar to you. You're finishing up a mix and it's sounding spot on. The drums are nice and punchy, the instruments are well balanced and aren't competing with each other, the choruses are punching you right in the face. But then you toss on your limiter, or send it off to get mastered, and your excitement fades. The snare has practically disappeared, instruments are fighting with each other for space, and your choruses no longer sound bigger, just more squashed. Now you have to go back into your mix, try to compensate for these changes, try the limiter again, rinse and repeat. I struggled with that for a long time, but once I started mixing into my limiter, that all changed. Since you're hearing the effect of the limiter from the start, you're compensating for what it's doing in real time as you mix. Besides saving me a ton of time by not having to go back and fix all these things in my mixes, it pretty much instantly led me to making way better mixes. It was such a game changer for drums. Like I said, the whole limiter smashing my snare drum thing was a real problem for me before I started doing this. And if you've seen a bunch of my videos, you probably know that I'm a big fan of lots of automation in most of my mixes, and that was always a problem too. You think you boosted the guitars enough in that one spot to add a ton of excitement until your limiter smashes it back down later. Limiting from the start has led me to have way more dynamic and exciting mixes while also taking less time. Win-win. And this doesn't just work for stuff you're mastering yourself. I'll still mix into my limiter on tracks that are going to be mastered by somebody else, and I've had pretty much the same results. The masters sound more dynamic, punchier, and more like how I intended the song to sound than before I did this. If you are sending your mixes off to mastering, just remember to take the limiter off before you print your mix. You can also send them the limited version as a reference for them, but they're definitely going to want the unlimited version. So be sure to try this out on your next mix. Like I said at the beginning of the video, this might not work for you, and that's totally okay. Nothing's going to work for everybody, but I'd be willing to bet that a lot of you will see pretty major improvements by using this technique. And if you like this video, be sure to leave a thumbs up, subscribe, leave a comment, all that good stuff, and head on over to BetterMixes.com to learn more about your new favorite drum samples, my mixing course, one-on-one mix coaching, and a whole lot more.